Hello. Oi, gente, boa noite. I'm going to speak first in Portuguese. I'm going to present our observatory, and then I'm going to speak in English and talk with Cynthia. So, o Observatório Feminista de Relações Internacionais é uma iniciativa voluntária e independente de análise e monitoramento da política internacional com uma lente feminista. Nossa pesquisa abrange desde mulheres na política até o debate teórico, mas a gente se concentra principalmente em análise de conjuntura. Hoje, o nosso observatório conta com 54 membros no caso, que estão divididas internamente em 6 grupos geográficos, com um grupo de mulheres na política e um grupo de mídias. Nós também temos 8 coordenadores regionais que ajudam eu e a Giovana Zucato a fazer tudo isso funcionar, então eu queria aproveitar esse momento para agradecer não só às pesquisadoras do OFRE, mas a todas as coordenadoras, a coordenação de mídia, todo o pessoal de mídia que está ajudando a divulgar o Café com o OFRE até hoje. E o OFRE foi construído durante a pandemia, enquanto a gente estava organizando a nossa estrutura, eu enviei um e-mail para a Cíntia, falando o que a gente estava fazendo, e perguntei o que ela achava, o que ela podia falar com a gente, e ela respondeu de uma forma muito calorosa e encorajou a gente a continuar. E aí hoje ela aceitou estar aqui com a gente nessa conversa. Não que precise ser apresentada, mas eu vou apresentar. Cynthia Low é uma teórica feminista de relações internacionais e professora e pesquisadora do Departamento de Desenvolvimento Internacional, Comunidade e Meio Ambiente, com filiação em Ciência Política e Mulheres e Estudos de Gênero, todos na Clark University. Ela escreveu mais de 15 livros, excluindo suas 2 obras mais famosas, que é o Maneuvers, International Politics of Militarizing Women's Lives, and Bananas, Beaches and Bases, Making Sense of Feminist Politics. Ela também atua no conselho editorial do International Feminist Journal of Politics e muitas outras revistas acadêmicas. Ela também é membro da WPF, e em 2015, o International Feminist Journal of Politics, junto com a Taylor Francis, criou o prêmio Cynthia Low em homenagem à sua pesquisa feminista pioneira na política internacional. So now I'm going to talk in English so you can understand me. I'm going first to present our observatory. So the Feminist Observatory of International Relations is a voluntary and independent initiative to monitor and analyze international politics with feminist lens. Our research covers from women in politics to theoretical debates, but we focus mainly on scenario analysis. Our observatory counts now with 54 members that are divided into 6 geographical groups, a group of women in politics, and a media group. We also have 8 regional coordinators that helps me, and Giovanna, there is the other general coordinator to run everything. OFRE was built during the pandemic, and when we were still organizing things, I sent an email to Cynthia, and I thought she would never answer. Like, I found her email online and I sent it, and I thought she would never answer, but she answered like the next day, and I was really happy. I was like jumping all over my home. Yeah. And she answered encouraging us a lot in a very warm way, encouraging us to keep our work and to keep her posted, actually. And since then, we exchanged a few emails, and today she actually accepted to be here, and I would like to thank you very much. Our support since day one had been really important to encouraging us and to make sense of our group, you know. So now I'm going to present you, Cynthia. Not that you need to be presented, but Professor Enlow is a feminist theory of international relations and a research professor in the Department of International Relations, International Development, Community and Environment, in affiliation with political science and women and gender studies, all at Clark University. She wrote more than 15 books, including the 2 most famous, Maneuvers, the International Politics of Militarizing Women's Lives, and Bananas, Beaches and Bases, Make Feminist Sense of International Politics. She also currently serves on the editorial advisory boards of International Feminist Journal of Politics, Security Dialogue, Women, Politics and Policy, International Political Sociology, Critical Military Studies, and Political and Gender. She's a member of WPF International Academic Network. And in 2015, the International Feminist Journal of Politics, together with Taylor and Francis, created the Cynthia Low Award in honor of Cynthia's pioneering feminist research in international politics. Hi, Cynthia.
Hi, Giovanna.
Hi. It's an honor to have you here. It's an honor to be here. I'm really happy now.
Well, I'm just so admiring of the work that the observatory is doing, and all of you who I can't see, but all the participants, you are part of the revolution.
Thank you. So let's start with our questions.
Sure.
We're going to talk a little bit about politics, militarization, gender, and masculinities. So lately we have seen a huge expansion of alt-right governments, like Orbán in Hungary, Trump, the ex-president of the US, Bolsonaro here in Brazil. And those governments, they have really specific relations with gender and militarized questions. Since the debate about abortion to the subjugation of women in their speeches, the use of the mother of the nation ideal to really specific decisions like Bolsonaro's decision to not sign any UN or international resolution with the term gender written. Also, they have a really militarized discourse and imagery. I would like you to talk a little about this relation between alt-right governments, a militarized discourse, and gender.
Well, yes. I mean, let me give a couple of warnings here. And that is that militarized governments can sometimes not look like ultra-right governments. They can look like governments that just have big defense budgets, or they can look like governments or political systems in which somebody who has had a military career will become a civilian and run for office, and voters will find that person very trustworthy because they've been in the military. Or they can look like a country that has celebrations on holidays to celebrate the victory and supposed victory in some war. And these can all look very, they can look kind of not normal. You know, I would never say anything that's militarized is normal, but they can look as if they aren't ultra right. And so one of the things I just want to kind of alert us to, like put up a, you know, if you're a sailor and there's a big storm coming, you know, you hoist a yellow flag that says warning. And so this is my feminist warning about militarism. Militarism can come in a lot of different varieties. When it comes in the form of a Bolsonaro, or it comes in the form of another general performing a coup d'etat, as in Myanmar right now in Southeast Asia, right? When it comes in that form, it's terrible to put it this way, but that's kind of the easy ones because it's so blatant, right? It is so bold. It is in, as we would say, in neon, that is in bright lights. But most militarism in most societies comes in much more subtle forms. It comes in the form of, do mothers, this is about the militarization of motherhood. You can militarize anything, right?
Yeah.
When I teach a seminar with mid-level civil servants, that is mid-career civil servants from 6 different African countries. And they're all getting to know each other. They don't know each other that well. And a lot of people from one African country don't know much about another African country. So I would ask the question in this multinational class of people who are very observant and very professional, men and women, majority women. And I would say to the class of 20 people in this seminar, I'd say, so tell me, what would your mother think if one of your brothers said one day that he wanted to join the country's military? And the women from Malawi, in Malawi, one of the countries in southern Africa, the women from Malawi said to everybody else in the group, said, my mother would have a fit if my brother said he was going to join the military. That's not a successful son. That's not a source of pride for mothers. Definitely not. But the women from Mozambique, which of course was a Portuguese colony, just like Brazil, but more recently independent, though women from Mozambique said, oh, now it's interesting. 10 years ago, my mother would have been quite proud if my brother said he was going to join the Mozambique state military. But now, this is about the demilitarization of mothers in Mozambique, but now they said, my mother wouldn't think it was such a great idea anymore. Right? So in that group of mid-career professionals, there was a wonderful discussion about, well, how militarized is your mother? Because the militarization of motherhood is really crucial for any country where the government is really trying to push militarization. Does that make sense? That is, militarizers in any country have to militarize women as mothers, because they have to persuade mothers, which is really hard to do in a lot of places. They have to persuade mothers that it's good for their mothering, for their son to want to join or stay in the military. So the thing about the ultra-right governments now, and you have to really watch this. So if you take Hungary, Hungary is not a militarized government. It is a patriarchal government. It is a misogynist government. It is an autocratic government. But it's not a government run by former military people. Orban himself is very corrupt and makes a lot of money off of European Union subsidies, right? But it's not the military walking the streets in Budapest, the capital of Hungary. If you take Erdogan in Turkey, he came into power. He's not a military man. He came into power against the military, because the military was the bastion, was the supporter of secular government. And Erdogan wanted to push back against secularism in Turkey and have a more religiously oriented political party in power. That's his party. So I just want to put up a warning here that I think the main characterization of the ultra-right populist governments, and you mentioned several of them, right?
No.
Is really their misogyny more than the role of militarism per se. They are anti-democratic. They're really afraid of free elections. They're really afraid of checks and balances with the legislature. They're really afraid of having independent judges. They're afraid of all of those things. They are convinced that a strong nation requires the government to control women's bodies. They're very afraid of feminism as a result. Yeah. But they differ. If you think of all the governments you're thinking of, they differ as to how blatantly militarized they are. Probably of all the governments you just mentioned, Giovanna, today, of all those ultra-right governments, probably Brazil is the most militarized of the governments you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Right? So militarism, I mean, what you always have to do is watch militarism and watch patriarchy, but watch them, they're always interwoven, but they are not the same. So what stands out to me, and I'm not a Brazil specialist, what stands out to me about the Bolsonaro government is that Bolsonaro himself tries to claim that because he was a military officer, he is the best person to be in power in Brazil's public life. Well, Erdogan, for instance, can't make that claim in Turkey. Orban can't make that claim in Hungary, right? The other thing about Brazil is that, well, I don't have to tell you this, but I'm just reminding myself here. But especially when you are comparing it to, say, Hungary, which is a really good country to think about. I mean, it's a very worrisome country. Is to think that the military in Brazil is itself such a powerful institution, and as you've told me in emails, the Brazilian police have become so militarized, right?
They are actually militarized, like the foundation of the police in here in Brazil, it's militarized.
That's right. That's right.
They have like patterns, they have guns, they have everything that is all actually militarized.
Yes, and that is also true in the United States. That more and more police departments have acquired over the last 20 years. You can date it. I mean, put everything in historical position. Whatever you're interested in, this is to everybody who's listening to us. Whatever you're interested in, try to watch it over time. Here's the good news. If you watch something like the militarization of the Brazilian police, try and find at what point did it really leap up in militarization, in terms of tactics, in terms of language, of who they think the enemy is. Watch any police if they talk about enemies. And that usually starts at a very particular point. And watch their equipment, right? But then the fourth thing to watch is watch how, or if they are coordinated with the state's military in their operations. In all those forms, one of the things that stands out about Brazil today is how militarized the police are, right? Yeah. So that's remember my warning flag out on the sailboat, that is keep misogyny, that is a disparagement of, a hatred of, a dismissal of anything feminine, and that's oftentimes holding up patriarchy. Keep that, at least analytically, as part of the observatory, what you watch, keep it separate from simply right-wing autocracies, and then watch how they do or don't interact. But one of the things that I've learned is that none of us, we cannot monitor militarism unless we watch not just the militarism of men and the militarism of boys. Militarism starts when people are children. But we have to watch how militarism infects women's lives and which women resist it. Like not wanting their sons to go into the militarized police or go into the military.
I have a question that was actually not here, but came up with your talk.
Sure.
We can only talk about militarized governments if the leader or the president or the leader of the country is a military man, or no. Like, okay. So
you can have I mean, in some ways, before Bolsonaro, so say 8 years ago, Brazil was quite militarized, even though it had a civilian head of government, right?
Yeah.
The election, which is now about the militarization of voters in Brazil, the election of Bolsonaro just made it more obvious, the militarization more obvious, because now you actually had a ex-military man talking about his military experience as if that was good for politics. But the militarization of Brazilian life was also quite advanced, if you will, before Bolsonaro, don't you think?
Yeah, yeah. I think that I always remember a talk that you make, that you were talking about once you were in Denmark and you were like walking with some feminists, and like the president or like some authority didn't have a fence in their home.
Right.
And
Iceland.
Yeah, Iceland, right. And I always remember that because here in Brazil that is impossible. And I live in Rio, that is like the most militarized place here in Brazil. And I always think about that. We are really used to militarization.
Yeah. No, and you know what, Giovanna, that's why it had such a big impact on me. I was with this same civil servant seminar group, mostly from Africa, from different countries in Africa. And we went to lunch at the president's house. And I haven't been to many presidents' houses, so I didn't know what to expect. But as the van drove us, there were maybe a dozen of us, and drove us, and I kept waiting for the guards, like
security.
That's right, security. I thought, well, wait, because the driver, who was Icelandic, said, "Oh, there's the president's house. We're very near." And I thought, well, how can we be near? I mean, there's no security. There's not only no fence, there is no guard. There's nobody coming out even to ask for his driver's license. And we can't, Iceland is one of the least militarized countries. Although Icelandic feminists say, look out, look out, look out. We are a member of NATO. So Icelandic feminists, Icelandic feminists have taught me a lot. And they say, look out, don't make us into heroes or angels. We are not heroes. We are not angels. We have all kinds of problems. We don't have a military. Iceland and Costa Rica, which of course I'm sure you know, don't have state military. But that doesn't mean we don't have creeping militarization via NATO putting pressure on us. But anyway, when we drove up to the president's house, Giovanna, you're right. There was no fence. There was no security. We parked the van. The 12 of us, mostly African men and women, and myself coming along as kind of a guest, went up, and I'm not kidding, we knocked on the door. Like, knock, knock. And the door opened, and it was the president, who said, "Oh, you've come for lunch. Come on in." But you're right. For somebody like me, who's an American, I come from such a highly militarized society that I could barely believe what was happening to me in Iceland with no fences, no security, and the president opening the door after we knocked. So it sometimes takes being in a really non-militarized society to wake any of us. So this would be Brazilians going to Costa Rica, right? You kind of realize how militarized you are when you go to a non-militarized country. So I'll give you another example. We have Italian friends, and one Italian friend is here as a scientist and so on. And so she has to fly to conferences and so on in the United States. And this is now Italy, which of course has had a highly militarized past and still is part of NATO and has a military, part of the state and so on. So that she doesn't come from Iceland, she comes from Italy. But she said, so she flew to a conference, and then we saw her for dinner after she got back from the conference. And she said, what goes on in American airports? We said, well, I mean, airports are crazy places anyway, but we said, what do you mean? She said, well, this was a very full flight. This was before the pandemic. This is a very full flight. And the announcer for the airline said, we are beginning to board. Would any member of the military please come up to be first on the plane and get your best seating? And she said, what? Members of the military get to board? This is a civilian flight, right? Get to board an ordinary domestic flight just because they're part of the military? And she said that would never happen in Italy. And I thought, oh my God, we are so much more militarized in the US than the Italians. And the Italians do not think of themselves as a non-militarized paradise.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have to be in other places for people to catch you and say, wow, what's going on here?
Just a comment. Here in Brazil, even like firefighters are military. They're like they are a militarized institution also. I think I always think about that.
Yeah, no, it's true. You have to look at private militarized too. But come back and let's get back onto masculinity, because it's not as if all these state militarized institutions are gender free. They're not, are they?
No, they aren't. I think that masculinity you say that in your book, that masculinity is really like close to militarization. There are things that are they are within each other. I don't think that like that's one of the questions, but we have like women armies, like the Kurdish Women's Army, the IPJ, that are an army that is trained and that is led by women, but it's an army. I actually would like you to talk a little bit about that, like military women, women that are in mainly men armies, and women that are in all women, but they're armies anyway.
Yeah, well, there are several. Now, just for all your participants, I know you know this, Giovanna, but we'll remind everybody who's listening.
Okay.
In the Middle East, there are at least, 5 Kurdish militaries. So you have to, when you're doing a gender analysis and asking exactly this great puzzle about if women have some kind of authority and some kind of policy making role in a Kurdish military, are we talking about the Turkish Kurdish military? It's a rebel. These are all insurgent militaries, right?
Yeah.
Are we talking about the Turkish Kurdish military, the PKK? Are we talking about the Syrian Kurdish military? Are we talking about the Iranian insurgent Kurdish military? Are we talking about the Iraqi Kurdish armed groups, right? And every one of those have a different gender politics. And so that means that within it, and I tell you this, I get a little nervous. This is just me being kind of, on guard, if you will. I get a little nervous when those of us who are outside become quite romantic about women in insurgent military forces. And I get nervous because I think we oftentimes, even those of us who are anti-militarism, we get a little romantic about women having the power to wield guns.
Yeah.
And over the years, I've become, I know women oppose oppressive governments, and I have a lot of, excuse me, I have a lot of respect and admiration for women and men who oppose oppressive governments. On the other hand, I've learned from the women in those militaries, in Iraq, in the Philippines, in Vietnam, in Eritrea, I have learned to be very, very cautious about how much long-term liberation women gain from embracing a militarized role. Oftentimes, in the middle of an insurgency, by the way, this is happening right now in Myanmar. There are lots of women in Myanmar who are trying to oppose the very oppressive, since February, very oppressive Myanmar government military coup, who are beginning to join armed insurrection. And as a feminist, I'm not going to stand outside and judge. I'm just, as an observer, thinking, okay, but be careful, look out. Militarism almost never liberates women. So I try both not to be superior and thinking I know best, because I don't.
Yeah.
But I also, we have learned from so many women, and the primary women I've been taught by are the Nicaraguan women, the women that were in the Sandinista rebellion against Somoza in Nicaragua. And those women joined and they became armed insurgents against the dictatorship of Somoza, but they have really lost out. And they began to leave the Sandinista party and form autonomous women's groups because they didn't like the continuing patriarchy of the armed male-led insurgent groups when they came into power. So
Do you think that it's okay? You can talk. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, do you think that it's possible to have a militarization that is not masculinized and it's not misogynist? No.
Well, the thing is, I think the way you've posed it is exactly the way to set up an investigation. Because one of the things that all of you in the observatory are doing, and what makes the observatory so exciting, by the way, I'm very excited about what you're doing. It's because you are figuring out what questions should feminist informed investigators, what questions should they be asking? And then the second thing, whenever you ask a question, you have to figure out a strategy for gaining reliable evidence so that you can try to answer your own question. So let's go back to your really good question. Do I think it's possible to have a non-patriarchal, non-misogynist military that is wielding lethal, that is causing death, lethal armaments? Do I think it's possible to have a non-patriarchal group, armed group, using lethal weapons as part of their campaign? That is, so they will kill and injure people in the name, supposedly, of a good cause. Do I think it's possible to have a non-patriarchal group? I think the only way you can answer it is take a group that's tried or is trying and watch the women in that group over a long time. Not over 2 years. You know, to be a feminist, you have to have a real, you know this, you have to have a real,
patience.
You have to have patience. You have to have stamina, right? You have to keep watching. Now, the thing is, because we're all investigators, you can turn out reports or evidence-based studies after a year, after 2 years, after 5 years, but you have to hang in there. You can't say, well, after 5 years, they weren't so misogynist. right?
Yeah.
But I want to come back and say, what about after 10? Right? And so far, so one of the things you can do is you can take every insurgent group in the 20th century and the 21st century, and we have a lot of them. So you've got a lot of evidence you can go gather, and start with El Salvador, Nicaragua, of course, Peru, right? Look at every place that's had an insurgent military against a dictatorship and try to see what's happened to men's attitudes towards women, including in marriage, including in terms of sexual relations, as well as who has political voice and who has real influence in the distribution of the budget, for instance, or writing reproductive laws. And then watch.
Yeah. It's a really long-term job.
Yeah, but you can start with the evidence we now have. I mean, that's a good, I mean, with that good question you asked. And that question is also about what happens to women who join state militaries. The US military is now 15% women. Has that changed the US military?
I think that Israeli military is a really good place to look at that because they have like conscription for women since the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, but not all women.
Yeah.
Only women who have not become mothers. That's not true of fathers. Only and mainly women who do not come from the most conservative social groups amongst Jewish women in Israel. So if you talk to Israeli feminists, they will not say that the Israeli military is non-patriarchal. They won't. That's not that the evidence they've gathered is that they've worked very hard to kind of reduce sexism in the Israeli military, but they don't think the Israeli military is non-sexist. And Israeli anti-militarist investigators, and they exist. Okay, let me do that again. Israeli feminist investigators investigate the Israeli military, and there's some very good studies in English, I'm afraid, and Hebrew, that give you an idea of how sexism continues to work in the Israeli military, despite, as you say, so many, not all, because there are big exemptions for women that don't exist for men. That's patriarchy. But in the Israeli military. I'll give you a
let's
name.
move to.
Yeah.
Okay, you can say it because my research about Israel, actually.
Oh, yeah, that's right. And so you know Orna Sassoon Levy, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Orna is fabulous. Orna is just great, right? And
she did an amazing field job with Israeli military women. Yeah.
That's right.
I really like her.
And you know what? You can learn because I know you do this research, you can learn so much about how did she build enough trust so that women in the military would talk honestly with her.
It's a really hard job to do.
Yes, but that's called feminist methodology, is building trust so that people will talk with you honestly and not just think you're some, condescending academic who looks down on them.
Yeah. I'm going to move to the next question.
Okay.
How can we relate the current attempt to a gender backlash in international organizations to the role of hegemonic masculinity in the execution of foreign policies?
Well, where there's an attempt now. It was first named by the Swedish foreign minister, Wallström, and she first named her foreign policy feminist foreign policy. And she was the first one who was actually a minister. She was in the UN, and her name is Margot, Margot, Margot Wallström, Waldstrom. And if you Googled her, you can see she speaks English, like so many Swedes do. And so she spelled out what she meant by a feminist foreign policy. And here's what Margot Wallström said. She had been in the UN, and she was one of the monitors of violence against women in the UN. So she learned a lot about misogyny in international organizations. And she said, what I mean for any government, to have a feminist foreign policy is the following. It must take women in foreign policy seriously. That means that women have to be respected for ideas, they have to be promoted, they have to be asked their opinions, you have to use women's experiences when you make up a foreign policy, for instance, foreign aid or climate change policy. You have to actually, what we say in social science is you have to gender disaggregate all your data. You can't just collect data on children. You can't just collect data on parents. You can't just collect data on farmers. You can't just collect data on fishing people. You have to collect that data and ask, where are the women in fishing and where are the men? Where are the women in farming and where are the men? Where are the women in poverty and where are the men? You have to ask, so that's the first question. That's the first thing you have to do to have a feminist foreign policy. You have to take women seriously, but in order to take women seriously, you've actually got to find out what their experiences are as distinct from men's experiences of the same thing. Never just say parents. Never just say children. Never just say climate change refugees. Never say refugees. Always gender disaggregate. So that's the first part of having a feminist foreign policy. The foreign policy has to be based on collecting gender disaggregated data to become the evidence for your foreign policy. Second thing she said is that women's rights have to be promoted in your government's foreign policy. So, for instance, if your government, any government, if your government is really serious about preventing another pandemic, because there will be another pandemic. I know Brazil, you're right smack in the middle of it now. You and India, right? But we don't have much gender data about.
No.
So if you, let's say you're a government and you want to have a feminist foreign policy, and one of them is around global public health, it means that you will ask about women's relationship to health and men's relationship to health before you instruct the WHO, the World Health Organization, to do something. That's the second part. You'll take women's rights seriously as part of whatever you're promoting in foreign policy. So the first is data and evidence. You have to find out what women's lives are like. Secondly, you have to take women's rights seriously and make sure that your foreign policy does nothing to harm those women's rights, but also promotes them. The third, she said, is that you promote human rights generally with a notion that women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. Now, this you can imagine. This means that all these governments now that are trying to roll back the international reproductive rights, and that's led by the Vatican, and the Vatican has a lot of allies that aren't all Catholic, being very afraid of women's reproductive rights being supported by the United Nations, and they're pushing back against it. And the fourth thing that Wallström said for a feminist foreign policy, by the way, she didn't achieve it in Sweden, so don't set up the Swedes as if they do everything perfectly. She
Yeah.
was the first, though, to lay it out when she was actually the head of a ministry. That's what makes Waldstrom so distinctive. She was actually foreign minister. She isn't anymore, by the way. She only lasted 2 years. So that's a very liberal center-left party in power, and she only lasted 2 years. She's back in parliament. But the fourth thing you said is when you promote development, economic development, you must always ask, are you promoting development in a way that promotes women's economic development? So let me give an example. In Brazil, but in the United States and in Cambodia and in China, garment exports, making apparel, is crucial to economic development. But if you promote garment exports as the ticket, as the pass for the country's economic development, but you don't ask, how are women as garment workers? And in most countries, women are 70%, 70% of all garment workers. So if you promote garment exports as a way for a country to develop economically, but you don't ask about the rights of women as garment workers, then you don't have a foreign policy. So it takes a lot. There's no country that has a feminist foreign policy. But now we've got, thanks to Waldstrom and others, now we at least have some measuring sticks to see whether any government, the Canadian government under Trudeau claims to have a feminist foreign policy, the Mexican government.
Yeah, I would talk about that.
Yeah. But because here's the good news, Giovanna. The good news is that at least these men in power, they think that they will look better to the world if they can claim they have a feminist foreign policy. Well, that's pretty amazing. That men in power think they need to claim they have a feminist foreign policy in order to look good to other men. I mean, really. But all of us as feminists who are comparing our notes and our experiences around the world, including Mexican feminists, we now have measuring sticks to say, no, you don't get to say you have a feminist foreign policy just by saying it. Here are the measures, and we want to know how you measure up according to that measure and that measure and that measure and that measure and that measure. And then we'll tell you whether you have a feminist foreign policy or not.
Yeah, I think that Mexico is really emblematic because they have like a huge repression against feminist movements, like in March 8th and like all over the year, but they claim to have a feminist foreign policy. I always think that is really interesting.
Yeah, well, but that's why it's really important in Brazil and the US and Mexico and every place. It's really important to have a women's movement.
Yeah.
Because how a government relates to their own local civil society women's movement is a measure of whether they really are serious or just, putting it up for display.
Since we're talking about women's movement, that question was not here actually, but I would like to talk a little bit about what happened in Chile. I think that Chile, yeah,
Yes.
last year, because it's the first time we're having like a constitution that have half of women, and I think that is important, and I would like you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You know more about Chile than I do. I mean, I had a very good Chilean feminist friend, Jimena Bunster, who was part of the Chilean women's movement that brought down Pinochet, and she taught me a lot. And so, but this most current one started with students, and it really, in some ways, was set off that is the movement, that's become so much bigger now and deeper. But it was started off by the conservative government um, proposing higher school fees, and and that would have just um, widened the already wide. So it's already wide. The wider class inequality between um, people in Chile, and the students who led the protest were the students who they and their families would have been most affected by these increasing school fees. So it's an interesting thing. It wasn't necessarily at first, it wasn't it wasn't a women's movement that kicked off the protest, but as the students, and this is something you'd have to investigate, as the students gained wider and wider support, as they began to talk more and more about all kinds of inequities and what were the causes of them in post-military, post-Pinochet Chile, amongst the young people themselves, more and more of the women amongst the young students began to say, this can't be led just by the young men. If we're going to be a really pro-equity, pro-justice, fairness, remaking Chilean society, then right in the movement, women have to be amongst the speakers. They can't just be in the back applauding the smart young men. And so you began to watch a feminist dynamic inside a movement that didn't start out as a feminist movement. And if you did interviews, it's a great research. I'm always thinking of, I'm very greedy. So I always want other people to go off and do all this research and then tell me. So what I'd like to know is what happened between month 1, month 3, month 6, inside the student-led young people's movement in Chile that really raised the question of gender equality in the movement, not just in Chilean society, but in the movement. And that would be, because you're right, the result of there's a movement inside the movement. And that's true of almost every social movement. What are the relations between men and women inside a pro-democracy movement? What are the relationships between men and women inside a peace movement? What are the relations between women and men inside an anti-military movement? And it doesn't, we've seen in Nicaragua, it doesn't always work out that if you have a movement in the movement, that will actually change the movement. But in Chile, it seems to have. And now we have to watch what happens with the Constitution writing, which is going on now.
I'm really excited to see what's going to happen in Chile, because I think that it's something new that came from social movements and got into politics, and had a really leadership of women. I think that is going to be really interesting.
But here's the thing, here's for all your participants, the thing to ask is, how did that happen?
Yeah.
Because my guess is in about month 4 or 5, some young women began to watch the men take the lead and begin to say, whoa, wait, what is this pro-democracy movement we're for? What is this equality movement we're for? So something happened inside. And here we want to know, and we'll probably have to get this from Chilean feminist investigators, what happened inside the movement?
I was reading today a part of her book when you're talking about rape as an instrument of national security in Chile, and I was thinking a lot about that. During the protest, they have a lot of cases of rape of women, and even like that, like the movement a lot, and the end was the Constitution.
Yeah, And in fact, this has been true in Egypt. But the thing is, who are the rapists? Sometimes the rapists will be men who are in the government's police force, and they will use sexual assault to try and oppress the women protesters or drive them home, right? Drive them out of the protest for fear of sexual assault or sexual shaming. Sometimes the government won't use their police as the male police, as the rapists against the protesters. They'll call in civilian men who they pay, but don't wear uniforms. And so we've learned now that when you see sexual assault in any country, this is now Myanmar, watch Myanmar right now, but watch Egypt in 2011, watch Syria in 2000. They're very specific places to watch. All right, we don't have to make this up. We've got, and watch who perpetrated the sexual assaults on the women protesters. Was it military men? Was it police men? Was it civilians not in uniform but paid by the government or paid by the police, which is the same, to come in and sexually assault women protesters? Who was it? Was it just simply conservative men who weren't paid by the police, but they were just so outraged to see women out in public doing what women weren't supposed to do, which is be political and vocal? And ask who the rapists were. So whenever we talk, this is true in war, and it's true in political strife. Whenever you hear about women were raped or girls were raped, try not to use that sentence. That's in English grammar, that would be called a passive. It's grammatical. It's okay. It's good grammar. It's just bad politics. That is, say, when women are raped by certain men, when they are protesters, who are the men? And why are they assaulting women as protesters? Always name the men. And which men? Because in Egypt in 2011, one of the things many Egyptian young pro-democracy women said is that it was so many Egyptian men who were their colleagues was for the first time that they did not engage in harassment. Those young men who were out protesting the military government did not engage in casual kind of street harassment. But somebody was paid and organized to sexually assault those Egyptian women. And the question is who and how. Don't say all men when you don't mean all men. Yeah. I mean, I don't mean you, any of us. We should not say men. We should try and say which men. And who organized them, sometimes who paid them, who rewarded them, what was their incentive, what did they think they were doing? Rape never happens without a man.
Yeah.
So you have to name them all.
I'm going to start with public questions because we have a few.
Yeah.
So the first one is, I would like to ask if she thinks that one way out of the gender structure is to abolish gender.
Oh.
It's a really
right. Question. Well, I mean, it is true that ideas, and this is why the non-binary movement is probably a very healthy movement. In this sense, it's not, I mean, sometimes here's another way of asking. It's almost like your earlier question, Giovanna. Can you have gender without patriarchy? Well, it might be possible. It is possible. to have women who really think of themselves as female, who are still respected and trusted and listened to and taken seriously by men who think of themselves as men. It is possible, but it is certainly true, and you're a good questioner, whoever you are, hi. It is certainly true that the ideas of masculinity and the ideas of femininity have been for so many years, in so many different cultures, all kinds of cultures, with all kinds of religions, all kinds of historical experiences, have still tried to manipulate ideas about femininity, which means what it means to be a woman or a girl, and ideas about masculinity. They've been manipulated to create hierarchies, to create inequalities, and that makes gender very, very loaded. But not impossible. I'm a little more of an optimist. I think you can have non-patriarchy with many women still thinking themselves as female and many men thinking themselves as male, but not thinking, if they think of themselves, but not thinking that masculinity, it comes in one form, and not thinking that masculinity means that they're smarter. But it's hard.
Yeah, it's hard.
Right. Yeah, gender has been so misused for the sake of inequality.
Makes the world go around, right?
Yeah. It's possible, but it takes a lot of work.
Yeah. The other question is, what you can say about women who are used as a war tactic, like ethnic cleaning and sexual slavery? What you can say about that?
Well, I think this comes back to our earlier conversation, which is militarism. That is a whole package. Militarism is a package of ideas. It's not one idea, it's a package of ideas. And one of the parts of that package, and it's a really crucial part, which means that feminists are really so important in resisting it, is that you can control men can control other men. This is a militarized, misogynist strategy. The strategy is that men can control other men by controlling the women in their lives. Let me do that again, because you can look at any war, any autocratic, racist movement. This is how racism works. That men can control or claim superiority over other men. This is men in rivalry with men. So either they're in direct rivalry or they're trying to create a hierarchy between men. White men and black men. Tamil men and Sinhalese men. Buddhist men and Muslim men. That's in Southeast Asia. That men are trying to create hierarchies amongst men by controlling the women in those men's lives. And that is sometimes carried out by some men try to gain control over other men by showing that they can, at will, sexually shame, assault the women in those men's lives. That's called ethnic cleansing via rape or threat of rape, because a lot of rape culture is not actually carrying out the rape, although that happens horrifically enough. It's the threat of it. And you hear a lot of mothers and fathers, and again, remember, don't just talk about parents. You hear a lot of mothers and fathers in war zones saying, we had better flee, become refugees. We better flee for the sake of sparing our daughter. And so you have ethnic cleansing, that is, that family leaving the town, not because their daughter has been raped, but the mother and the father, and they may disagree, but the mother and the father together decide, for the sake of our daughter safety, we should leave town now. And they leave their house vacant. And that becomes a form of ethnic cleansing, not by rape itself, but by the threat of rape.
And it had become really common since Bosnian War and since the Rwandan genocide, right?
Well, here's the real question, Giovanna, and for all your questions. Has it become more common, or did all of us just wake up to it?
That's a really good question.
I mean, if you look at Europeans displacing indigenous people throughout Latin America as well as North America. Question: what role did the European men's threat of sexual abuse of indigenous girls and women play in that displacement?
Ethnic cleansing.
So I think what is true, that we were all so slow, we didn't have enough feminist curiosity. We are also slow in asking that question, that it was mainly thanks to African investigators in Rwanda in 1994 and former Yugoslav feminists in 1992 to 95 who began asking that question. And that's why those two cases, horrible cases, caught all of our attention and woke us up and said, oh my God, we've never asked that question. We have to ask the question. And this again comes back to evidence collection. It's partly that health workers and refugee agency workers began to really ask, what was the trauma that the girl has suffered? And really beginning to record how often girls and women had been sexually abused that they became refugees, or that they were traumatized and sought medical help, but wouldn't say why. So it's that you had more feminist doctors, more feminist nurses, and more feminist people with feminist curiosity in refugee agencies, that those two wars began to really wake us all up. I've got time for two more questions.
Okay, so in WPS agenda and National Action Plan that have been created, there are many objectives related to the participation of women in militarized places and in order to mainstream gender. Do you think there is going to be a way to balance this goal without the militarization?
Good for you. This is a great question. Okay, for those of you who don't follow the UN that closely, WPS stands for, in English, of course, the imperial language, right? It wouldn't be this order of, if it were in Portuguese. It's women, peace, and security. And I think it's really important that we say the words rather than the initials. Women, peace, and security. This was a resolution that was developed by feminists who worked and lobbied the United Nations in October of 2000. And they proposed it to the Security Council, which is a highly masculinized, pretty militarized part of the United Nations, even when there are women, a few of them, on the Security Council. And the feminists who really created this new idea of a resolution that would obligate all of the United Nations and all member states of the United Nations to an agenda that linked women to sustainable peace, to genuine security. Now, once you start talking about genuine security, you're talking about reproductive rights for women. Women can't be secure if they don't have reproductive rights. Women can't be secure if the peace that is created is simply a putting down of arms. It has to be genuine peace, meaning not a continuation of violence. So you're a good questioner there. Hi. Your good questioner has noticed something that's going on. The members of the Security Council, which are all government states, and Brazil rotates on, off and on. The United States is always on, one of the 5 permanent members. Those Security Council governments didn't really want a resolution that obligated them to think about women in connection to creating sustainable peace, in creation of genuine security. But the feminist lobbyists were very good, and the government of Namibia and the government of Bangladesh were both on the Security Council in October of 2000, and they get a lot of credit. There were 2 men from Bangladesh and from Namibia, and they get a lot of credit for getting what's called Security Council Resolution on Women, Peace, and Security 1325, getting it through. But now, and this is why your question is a 2021 question, now there's an attempt to kind of shrink. Well, what does the Women, Peace, and Security agenda really mean? And some people want to shrink it down to, oh, let's just have more women in the peacekeeping operations that are funded by the UN. Well, that's a shrinkage. That wasn't the original intent. So you do have to watch it. It doesn't mean having more women in the UN's funded peacekeeping operations in Congo, for instance. It doesn't mean that's not a good thing. It just means that's not enough at all. Because as you hint of here, simply having more, this comes back to one of Giovanni's great questions at the beginning, just having more women in a state military is not liberation. Thanks, everybody. I've really enjoyed this. This is great.
Thank you so much. You
are remaking the world, you know.
Thank you. I'm just trying to do something.
More than something, a lot.
Thank you so much for your time, for your attention, for your answers. It was really good. I think that everyone loved it. So I hope that we can keep in touch and that we can do it more times, perhaps sometimes in person.
Absolutely. Next time in person.
Yeah.
But even before that, on screen. That's good.
Yeah. Thank you.
Take care. And keep me posted with what you're doing. I want to know now.
Okay. I will keep you.
Take care.
You.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.